Welcome back to our final explainer covering Janita's story. Today, we're getting into the really powerful conclusion of her journey, and we're going to focus on something I think we can all relate to, what professional growth and success actually feel like. Because, it's almost never what we think it's going to be.
Okay, let's start right here. We all have this picture in our heads, don't we? Especially when you're in a leadership role. You think a win, a real victory, is going to feel like that big, obvious finish line moment. And Janita was no different. She was bracing for that huge, dramatic sigh of relief after all those weeks of work.
But what she got was, well, it was much, much quieter than that. It wasn't the arrival of something great, but the absence of something bad. It was like a constant low-grade headache you've had for so long, you almost forgot what it felt like to not have it. And that's really the first taste of what professional realism looks like. Progress isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the friction you no longer feel.
So this subtle feeling, this easing of the headache, it's a signal. It means the teams are shifting into a new phase of working together. It's what people who study organizations call the norming stage. Now, this doesn't mean everything's perfect, not by a long shot, but it does mean things are finally becoming workable.
So, what exactly is norming? Well, it's not about everybody suddenly becoming best friends and singing campfire songs. It's about establishing functional, get-the-job-done rules that actually work within the messy reality of the situation. It's a practical piece, not a perfect one. It's just a lowering of the temperature in the room.
And this is where Janita had this huge realization. She had to completely abandon her initial vision of one big, happy, unified team. She was forced to see that norming was going to look totally different in the two very, very different cultures she was trying to manage. And just look at the difference here. It's night and day. At Riverside, with its strict power culture, cooperation was a cold, functional calculation. It was structurally sound, sure, but also pretty limited on a human level. But then you have Coppice Land, with its person-centered culture. For them, it was all about clarifying the warmth that was already there and turning it into a genuine professional partnership. Two completely different results, but both, in their own way, a version of success.
This quote from Dev, wow, he's the guy right in the middle of this whole thing, and this admission is just huge. It's the exact moment when he, and by extension, Janita, finally accept reality. You just can't force one culture's way of being onto another. You have to meet them where they are.
So, armed with this tough, hard-won piece of wisdom, Janita has to walk into her biggest test yet, explaining this entire near disaster to the trust board. This was her big chance to turn a massive crisis into a moment of real institutional learning.
And her opening line? It is an absolute masterclass in leadership. Right away, she completely reframes the conversation. This isn't about pointing fingers and asking who's to blame. It's about asking, what went wrong with our system and how can we learn from it? That one sentence changes the entire energy in the room from a witch hunt to a strategy meeting.
Then she lays out this incredibly clear three-part plan. Yeah, she deals with the immediate fires, the individual and structural problems, but she spends most of her energy focusing the board's attention right here, on the systemic level, because that's the only part that's actually going to stop this from happening all over again.
Inevitably, a trustee pushes back, asking if all this cultural analysis is really realistic. And Janita's comeback is just devastatingly effective. She basically says, you want to talk realistic? Let's talk about the 16 weeks of chaos and cleanup we just went through. Or we could spend 10 minutes thinking about this stuff up front next time. The point was definitely made. This brings us to what I think is really the emotional and intellectual heart of this whole story. It's Janita's private moment of taking stock, of figuring out what was actually achieved and, just as importantly, what wasn't. I mean, if you just look at the checklist, it looks like a slam dunk. The immediate crisis, resolved. Dev, the key person, functioning just fine. The new agreements, they're being followed. The board, they bought into her systematic changes. On paper, it's a win.
And yet, Janita knew the real story. She knew that Graham's power culture at Riverside hadn't magically vanished. He was just compliant because it was easier for him right now. She knew Coppice Lane's all-absorbing person culture would always be a risk that needed careful management. The wins were real, yes, but man, were they fragile.
So this is it. This is the big takeaway. This is the wisdom you gain when you lead in messy, complex systems. It's not about finding permanent, perfect fixes. It's about accepting that small, marginal, temporary gains, making things better, not perfect. That's the real feeling of success. And that has to be enough.
So this entire grueling ordeal boiled down to 4 incredibly profound lessons that Janita wrote down in her journal.
And honestly, they're a perfect roadmap of her journey and a powerful framework for any of us trying to lead. First up, cultural literacy. She learned that an organization's culture isn't just the fluffy stuff, the vibe of a place. No, it's the primary engine. It determines everything. As theorists like Charles Handy have shown, you have to be able to read an organization's deep-down operating code to know what moves will actually work.
Second, systemic diagnosis. This was her biggest mistake at the beginning. She was trying to fix Dev, the person, when Dev wasn't the problem. He was just the symptom. Thinkers like Peter Senge tell us the real disease was in the broken system that was crushing him. You have to treat the system, not the person it's breaking.
Third, calibrated compliance. Okay, this was a tough lesson. Janita's natural style is all about building relationships, and that's a fantastic tool, but it's not a magic key that opens every door. In a power culture, as compliance theory points out, sometimes you have to put down the friendly approach and pick up the rulebook and use your structural authority.
And finally, maybe the most personal lesson of all, correcting projection. She realized her default instinct, her mental model, was to assume everyone else was basically like her. The answer wasn't to stop trusting her gut. It was to start treating her gut feeling as a hypothesis, one that she had to test against the cold, hard evidence of the reality in front of her.
And all of this leaves us with the one big question that kind of hangs over this whole story. Janita learned the virtue of accepting reality and working within real-world constraints. But it forces every leader to ask themselves a very difficult question. Where is that line? When does being a professional realist stop? And when does it start to look a lot like being complicit in a system that's still broken? That's a question worth sitting with.